Welcome back to my channel, WSIB Truth Matters with Joe Marhshal. This is the second video of this three-part series. Today I'm going to talk about the biggest changes to the WSIB system that took place in the 90s and how that fueled the growth of my company, Marhshal Paralegals Professional Corporation, to pretty much all across Ontario. I'm going to be talking today mostly about those changes in the 1990s and how they ultimately impacted the benefit structure for injured workers in a negative manner, as far as I'm concerned, when I've compared the pre-Bill 162 legislation with the Bill 162 legislation implemented in 1990 and then Bill 99 that was implemented in 1998. So those big changes came in two different instances. So on January 1st, 1990, the WSIB implemented Bill 162. The big difference with that legislation and how injured workers were compensated for their injuries was how the benefits were calculated. So before January 1st, 1990, if you suffered a workplace injury and your weekly earnings were required, so in other words, if you lost time from work and it was a lost time claim, then the WSIB would have to pay you your weekly earnings based on 90% of your net average earnings. Very simple. If you took home $500 net per week pay, the WSIB would pay you 90% of that. That affected all of the benefits that you would have been entitled to receive as a result of your claim. So in other words, let's say that you had a claim or an injury that resulted in a permanent impairment, like my injury, for example, with my amputation and how it affected my abilities in certain ways. That pension was established based on a percentage of my weekly rate. So if I was awarded a 25% pension for my injuries, and that pension would go for the lifetime, or for my lifetime. So if I live to be 100, they're going to have to continue to pay me until I die. 25% of my net average earnings. That's how it was calculated. Of course, there were other factors that came into play when that net average earnings was calculated. And this is something that is extremely important that I'm going to touch on the final video, which led to the WSIB charging me with fraud. There are many other factors, and a lot of injured workers are being shortchanged and being paid less than what they're entitled. But anyway, for the sake of this example, 25% of the 90% net average earnings goes on for the lifetime of my injury. Of course, there are the yearly or annual indexing increases that are applied, which has been pretty much peanuts. But anyway, it does increase a little bit. If you were injured after January 1st, 1990, there was a dual award system to pay you for your weekly rate if you required time off work. So there was a non-economic loss award, which basically would compensate you. They call it pain and suffering. I called it pain and insult because it amounts to nothing. Even if you have the most of catastrophic injuries, it amounts to nothing. The calculations are done based on a formula that goes to the age 65, not for life. And basically, at the end of the day, if you've been through it, you're going to be shortchanged. It's based on a medical assessment by an independent doctor and a formula. It's complicated. I'm not going to explain it. You don't want to hear it, and it's a stupid system. But it is detrimental to the worker when compared to the pre-1990 law. The other part of the dual award system is the Future Economic Loss Award. And that is basically a calculation of what you are able to earn after your injury. And if you've been able to return to work in some capacity, and you're earning less than what you were at the time of your injury, that Future Economic Loss Award is supposed to pay the difference between what you're earning and what your pre-injury earnings were. Of course, taking into consideration the escalation of those earnings based on the indexing factor. So, in a nutshell, it seems to be somewhat reasonable. Where it is not, and where it is extremely detrimental to injured workers, and in hundreds, if not thousands of cases that my firm dealt with, is where the WSIB gets into what they call the deeming of wages. So what they deem that you're able to earn. So for example, if you're not able to go back to your pre-accident job and you require accommodations, or if you require vocational rehabilitation assistance to help you get back into a different career, a new career, the WSIB, through vocational rehabilitation, at the time was called labor market reentry. They're always changing. They have these creative words for the same bullshit. But anyway, if at the time that you're finished your program, and after you've been given a certain amount of time that they deem is appropriate for you to find a job, if you're not able to find that job, they're going to deem that you're able to earn what an entry-level salary would be for that position. And they're going to deem that that's what your wage loss is, and you're going to find a drop in your income. And I'm sure that some of you watching experienced that. In some cases, the circumstances, the employment circumstances, your injury perhaps even deteriorated. Maybe where you went to school or the career that you chose, there was a downturn in job opportunities when you finished your retraining, and therefore a lack of employment. There's all kinds of circumstances. Regardless of that, 9 times out of 10, the WSIB deemed that you would be able to earn that. And they calculated your benefits based on that. And if you didn't appeal it, you were shit out of luck. And you probably feel that way right now. There's a way to address it. And I'm going to talk about that in my third video, and the tools that I've created to help you address that, regardless if it happened in 91 or 95 or any time after that. It can still be dealt with. Now, that dual award system, that Future Economic Loss Award, it only goes to age 65. So if you continue to suffer a wage loss, and for some reason you weren't able to reach the earnings that they expected that you would, at 65, that Future Economic Loss Award will stop. And probably right about now, given that we're in 2023, you probably already saw that happening. And then what are you going to do? Well, Canada Pension Disability or whatever other system they push you towards so that you're no longer their issue. So that system didn't work. It wasn't better than the pre-1990 system. But somehow they managed to jam that down people's throats. They got away with it. So in 1999, while they started all of this planning back in the mid-90s, they started thinking about another way to screw you even more. So the discussions and planning and all of these things that went in behind the scenes with these so-called politicians, they started to figure out, how do we go a step further, okay, to cut off the benefits or reduce the benefits of these poor bastards that don't know shit from a hole in the wall, because that's how they portray that or perceive the injured worker. How do we screw them even more? Excuse me. Well, they came up with Bill 99. Bill 99 was introduced on January 1st, 1998. So with Bill 99, some of the big differences are they did retain the non-economic loss part of the dual award system because it was working for them. They had very little to pay out. It literally screwed everybody that ever was entitled to that non-economic loss award because it was shameful. It added insult to injury as far as making you feel and giving you something that you felt in a minimal way compensated you for your loss. So they kept that one. But then they came out with this creative thing, which was to now take the future economic loss award, but no, we're not going to lock it in for 2 years, then review it, and then 3 years after that, review it again, and then lock it in. Because in some cases, that was actually beneficial to some injured workers, that system of reviews. They decided, no, we're going to have to review this once per year. Because if your circumstances change, we need to be able to deduct what we're paying you or cut you off entirely. So the only time that they ever decided, okay, we're going to have to lock this thing in at some point was after 72 months. After you having been granted that, they call it the loss of earnings benefit. And they figured after 72 months, nothing's going to change. But if it does, you need to tell us, because if you don't, then we find out later, we're going to penalize you for that. So the biggest change, though, with Bill 99 was time limits on appeals. You see, that is where the WSIB started thinking about how to aggressively tackle this unfunded liability they kept talking about, which by that time was well over $14 billion, and that they attributed that 100% to injured workers that were malingering, that were feeding off of this system. Injured workers were the major culprit, in their view, as to why this unfunded liability was out of hand. Never mind mismanagement, wasteful spending. And I could spend 5 videos on that, on how the board just squanders away money on wasteful spending and projects that deliver no real benefit to both workers or employers. But anyway, they decided, okay, we have this problem here that injured workers, they get smart, and now they have these representatives who are really, really smart and very crafty and very astute. And they're going to go back and try and deal with issues that took place 10, 15, 20 years ago. And because we have no mechanism in place to prevent that, because the law places no limit. The Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, under Bill 162 and before that, places no limits on how far back an injured worker can go to appeal and address an issue that was, in his or her opinion, not previously addressed properly. And so they needed to close that loophole. So there you go. Appeal time limits. So now you have 6 months to appeal a decision that was made in your case. And regarding labor market reentry issues, you only have 30 days. So now injured workers are supposed to get this crash course on the law and the WSIB Act, on Bill 162, And prior to that, Bill 101. And prior to that, well, there's many. But you're supposed to get a crash course, because if something happens you don't agree with, never mind the fact that you don't even know whether you should agree with it or not, because you don't know what you're entitled to in most cases. If you don't appeal within 6 months, you lose your right to appeal. So what they did was they closed off that loophole, which means that they can now project that this liability that was there, where they would have had to have the resources to pay for benefits that were resulting from issues that were being addressed from years before, and that number, nobody knows what it is, but I'm sure their actuaries do. They closed that off. Hey, good for David Marhshal. I'm going to talk about him at length in my third video, because he was the architect of, hey, how do we screw injured workers and make sure that we give them the tiniest little bit possible. I'll get into that in more detail in the next video, but you get the idea. So how are you going to appeal something if you don't know whether or not you would have been entitled to it to begin with? This whole situation, all it did was create massive backlogs within the WSIB's internal appeals branch and the Workplace Safety and Insurance Appeals Tribunal's backlogs, because they had worked diligently for at least a period of about 8 years to try and reduce those massive backlogs, and they'd made some headway in doing that. But now, Bill 99 comes along and it sets the appeal system back at least 20 years, because they're still trying to deal with it now, and we're in 2023. So, did Bill 162 and Bill 99 give any benefit whatsoever to the worker? No. Not in my opinion. Not in my analysis. If anything, it screwed the worker even more. Let me leave you with this thought. David Marhshal was hired January of 2010. He's what I call a political hack. He came in. His job was to cut everything and anything in sight to bring that unfunded liability of $14 billion down. Now, the government said, listen, if you can do it by 2027, we'll be happy with it. We'll be okay with it. That's legislation that supported that. But no, not for David Marhshal. He single-handedly launched the most brutal, vicious, destructive, and humiliating attack on injured and more ill workers and their families that I've ever witnessed in 30 years of dealing with injured workers and handling thousands of cases. Brutal, absolutely brutal and heartless. And he brought down or eliminated that unfunded liability. Well, tune into the next video, because it's the doozy. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me rant. I hope that I've left you with something. I'm sure you can tell that I'm very passionate about this. And yes, I'm still very pissed off. Not only about my injury and what they did to me, but what they continue to do to injured workers, who are the backbone of this country, of this economy. So the conclusion of this series is going to take place. I'm going to release that video on Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I hope you tune in to watch it. And thanks again for taking the time to listen. Have a great one.